I say you guys get along with your parents?
Art 101 with Mr. Burgher.
Hello again, friends, and welcome back to Art 101 with me, Mr. Burgher. I'm a professional artist and master educator attempting to bring you the best in art historical content. I always appreciate likes, shares, subscribes, or any interactions with the videos, so if you would be so kind, I would much appreciate it.
Boy, that's a jump.
So as many of you know, we've recently settled in from our move from Iowa to North Carolina, and so I want to jump back in to this book, Conversations with Artists by Seldon Rodman. He is really exceptional at putting together these conversations, formal and informal sort of interviews that he did with artists, and many artists that are in there. There are 35 American artists, sculptors, painters, various forms of artists that are in this collection. And so today I want to talk a little bit about a great American sculptor, Alexander Calder. If it is true, as William Carlos Williams says, that the pure products of America go crazy, then it is also true that the almost pure ones, the ones impure enough to absorb America wholeheartedly, but sensitive enough to reject, even though unconsciously, the impurities become the artists. Such a one is Calder. He is the embodiment of such characteristic American traits as candidness, gentility, acquisitiveness, energy, inventiveness, pragmatism. His distaste for theory and concept are American, and so is his dry humor. He has the advantage of having been an American so long through his heritage. Both his father and his grandfather were American sculptors. That he can live in France a good part of every year without any sense of expedite guilt and without becoming in the least bit French. And the fact that he doesn't have to make a living was in his case an advantage too. The material ends and pecuniary rewards never meant anything to him. He could and did make things solely for the satisfaction of making them. If they were cleanly cut, cleverly arranged, and ingeniously related, that was enough. They had to work. And in his early mobiles, working meant more than balancing and freely swinging. Hand cranks and even small motors were employed to give the sculpture a life, approximating the ambiguous American machine. There is a resemblance between Calder's procedure and that of the Wright brothers. It occurred to me when I saw the interior of the sculptor's studio in Roxbury, Connecticut. This was no studio such as sculptors had traditionally worked in throughout the ages. No casts, no marble, no plaster, no armatures, not a bicycle shop, to be sure, but certainly a machine shop. The floor was deep in steel shavings, wire, nuts and bolts, punched sheet metal. The benches sagged under laths and power saws. The air was busy with dangling contraptions, as the brothers in Dayton used to call their experimental warped airfoils and rudimentary engines. But more significantly, I thought, the Wrights too were in love with simplicity, with perfection of motion and economy of means. They began and ended their work as artists. Gliding and work with kites came naturally to them. They appropriated a small motor and attached it to their wings, but the motor was an afterthought, a sort of concession to the American spirit. They wouldn't be outdone by some mere mechanic. Neither speed nor any of the commercial or military uses of aviation interested them at all. Business killed Wilbur Wright. It also caught up with Orville, reducing him to 40 years of taciturn inertia. Calder, under no obligation to make his inventions complete or pay off, was more fortunate. His home, like the man himself, could only have come out of the 20s. 10 years earlier, Calder would have been a Beaux Arts academician. The American artist was not then ready for such freedom. 10 years later, he would have been preoccupied with his social significance or fighting against it angrily, like David Smith. As it was, he could enjoy all the advantages of being a dilettante, a bad boy, an expatriate, without having any of these aspects of his early development prey on his conscience. He is a dilettante. As a dilettante, he could experiment to his heart's content with clever wire caricatures of celebrities and with the animated mechanical clowns and monkeys of his miniature circus. As a bad boy, he could flout the traditions of Philadelphia's main lane and of generations of classical figure makers without a qualm. And as an expatriate, Calder was supremely fortunate in finding an international style at the height of its inventive vigor, ready to enrich his particular inventiveness with a wealth of similarly free-floating vocabularies and eager to accept his unique contribution. Mondrian's vibrating linear geometry, Duchamp's gadgets and approximations of motion, Arp's biologic free forms, Moreau's poetic fantasy, and Pinhead Freudian protagonists, the glass and plastic contributions of Garbo and Perversner, all were not so much influences as encouragements and justification for the otherwise seemingly wayward trail he was already blazing. Without this community effort, it is at least questionable whether Calder would have had the confidence to take his particular contribution of inventiveness and humor seriously. Quite literally, he forged, with these assets, his playfulness into a major artistic revelation of his world. Whether the results can be called a major art depends upon the degree of importance one places upon content, for it is surely in this department only that Calder's sculpture may ultimately be considered inconsequential. Calder himself makes no highfalutin claims. He is without pretensions, disarmingly so. Only in respect to the original motivation of his work does he go beyond the simple justifications of having fun and giving pleasure. A vision of the celestial universe, he told me, started him off. Even before he studied engineering, he had been enthralled by 18th century toys demonstrating the planetary system. That was in the period when I was playing around with motors. I had as many as 15 at one time. I felt that art was too static to reflect our world of movement. Then in 1930, when I visited Mondrian's studio and I saw slabs and strips of colored cardboard he had tacked on his wall, I said to myself, wouldn't it be amusing if they oscillated? But I painted in the weeks that followed, and then made my first stables. The same preoccupation is just as much with Calder today. Looking through one of my photograph albums, he stopped at a shot of Carl Mills's Bellerophon, poised horizontally on one foot in the Des Moines Art Center fountain. He shook his head. "What is the matter with it?" I inquired. "He never quite takes off." "He's trying hard," I said. "Too hard. Moreau doesn't try so hard as an artist like Mills, but he achieves more." And he went on to tell me of a friend who had taken him and Moreau to see an almost perfect studio in the south of France, hoping that the Spanish artist, who was at the moment without a studio of his own, might rent it. Moreau wasn't even looking at it. He had found a piece of pale blue cardboard in the bottom of an apple crate and was playing with it delightedly, mumbling, "Isn't it wonderful?" We never could get him to look at that perfect studio. He'd found what he wanted. I'd asked him whether the expression of tragic feeling in such sculptures as Michelangelo's Slaves in the Louvre appealed to him at all. The laborious aspect of such work is elemented in my approach to sculpture, he said. But the gay and the joyous, when I can hit it right, are there. Perhaps there is a depth of feeling lacking, as you imply. They call me a playboy, you know, he chuckled. I want to make things that are fun to look at, that have no propaganda value whatsoever. I'm frank to say that in religious pictures, What moves me is the plastic forms or the wonderful colors. Or in Bosch, who is anti-religious, I suppose, the endless invention of forms and symbols. My friend Peter Bloom wants to say something. I don't. Who comes out best? He held up his hand as if to indicate it was a real question. I asked him if he was moved or inspired by forms in nature. His wife Louisa, who is a grandniece of the philosopher William James, answered for him. When we drive somewhere, Sandy always notices the beauty of things that most people consider ugly or take for granted, like derricks, gas stations, derelict machines covered with rust, bridges. Louisa Calder, although she is already a grandmother, is surprisingly young-looking and attractive. I do like the dogwood tree, Calder interjected, perhaps because it has a shape. He looked at one out the window. A shape to hang things on. A rose has only a blush of youth, no shape. He returned to the question I had been asking him, about my method of work. First, it's a state of mind, elation. I only feel elation if I've got a hold of something good. I used to begin with fairly complete drawings, but now I start by cutting out a lot of shapes. Next, I file them and smooth them off. Some I keep because they're pleasing or dynamic. Some are bits I just happen to find. Then I arrange them, like paper collé, on a table and paint them. That is, arrange them with wires between the pieces if it's to be a mobile for the overall pattern. Finally, I cut some more of them with my shears, calculating for balance this time. I didn't ask how he knew when a piece was finished. The question had already been asked him on a television interview and appropriately answered when the dinner bell rings. I asked him the same question I had asked Lipchitz, whether he enjoyed doing sculpture on commission to complete or complement architecture. He did. The sculptures are often improved by being related properly to site and scale. Once I had to design one that crept up a circular stairwell, a fascinating problem. It was a hot day to begin with, and a thunderstorm had made the atmosphere even stickier, so we decided to go for a swim. While searching for a pair of trunks that could be scaled from Calder's enormous girth to mine, we wandered through a good part of the house that seemed to be all on one level. One lower-ceilinged room opening into another, and then another, like a telescope with wonderful diminishing sunlit perspectives, animated and made audible by mobiles hanging from above with waved and tinkled in the breeze. I've mentioned already that the house itself seems a product of the 20s. It's hard to say exactly why. The remade colonial with bohemian touches, the photographs, letters, and drawings massed from the floor to the ceiling, on certain walls, even on the doors, the surrealist notes, like a tack through the face in one snapshot. Calder had bought a lovely old farmstead with its 17 acres for $3,000 before northern Connecticut became as fashionable as Westchester County. A nearby farmer makes use of the fields gratis. Behind and to one side of the house is the 2 floors high studio, rebuilt out of an old barn. To the other side, and in front of the shallow swimming hole, is a small house which the artist built for his mother, who is 90 and who spoke with us, vigorous in voice and keen of eye, as we walked back from our swim. I asked Calder if she liked his sculpture. Well, he said, let's say she's gotten over regretting it's not like my father's. The only thing that really kept him from living all year round at his home in France, he said, was his mother, who develops alarming symptoms as soon as he's been away for any length of time. As soon as I reach the deathbed, she's had a miraculous recovery. Of course, our youngest daughter, who's in school in Putney, Vermont, keeps us here too. We went to the studio to take some pictures. I noticed among the anvils and welding irons some objects that had escaped my attention before. Driftwood treated as sculpture, roots, marionettes. I asked him whether he thought that representational sculpture had any future. Epstein and Germaine Richer still look alive, he said. I walked over to inspect the mobile made entirely from found objects, and he guessed my thought. It only works if you find things as good as the shape you were about to invent. I've used spoons as well as bits of bottles, but you can usually make something better, perhaps basing your design on what you found. To come back to your original question about the emotional content in sculpture, he drawled. I believe that in modern work, the sculptor has to bring with him more than half of the emotion. To most people who look at a mobile, it's no more than a series of flat objects that move. To a few, though, it may be poetry. I feel that there's a greater scope for the imagination in work that can't be pinpointed to any specific emotion. And that's the limitation of representational sculpture. You're often enclosed by the emotion, stopped. His wife, who had come in, was surprised to hear him talking this way. Usually, she said, Sandy makes jokes out of questions. Sandy grinned through those heavy jowls, a little dourly but cheerfully, as though he might make a joke out of this statement, but he didn't. His work is his religion, she went on. He is always expressing his sense of pleasure and his joie de vivre. He isn't an unhappy man. He isn't tormented. He enjoys life. She gave him a look of complete devotion. I looked at Calder, who was looking at her, and then at his work. I believe her. All right, I hope you appreciate that one as much as I do. Thank you for watching.
John, get out.